Well, hey, so my name is Chad Burns. As Dan said, I had the privilege of directing a film called Pendragon and then a film called Beyond the Mask. And I can tell you, Dan and the whole team, you guys have accomplished something significant because you've finished a movie. And films, as has been said before, films don't want to be made. They kick and scream and they fight against being created. And so the fact that you finished a film and that we're having a premiere tonight is a tremendous accomplishment. So, yeah, congratulations on finishing the course, staying the course, and bringing this to fruition. Because it's very easy to start a project; it's very hard to finish it. So, excellent job. And I know Dan and some of the other folks here who've been involved in working two jobs. You know, this is not like their full-time thing. Some of them were working on the job, and that was the position I was in. Pendragon, I remember a really funny moment when we were on set, and it was raining, and the cameras were covered with plastic, and there was an actor who was on the horse, all in his costume. There was about 20 extras lined up, about to charge out of this wood line for this big scene we had going. And for better or for worse, at that point in my career, I was also a full-time student, and I had a boss. I had a professor who I graded papers for, and we were literally about to call the action. And my cell phone rang, and I looked at it, and I was going to, not take the call, of course, but it was my boss. So I was like, shh, everybody be quiet. Hello, this is Chad, He's like, do you have those papers graded yet? I was like, the papers? But anyway, so congratulations to all you guys who have pulled this together. So there's absolutely no question that telling stories is very important, right? I think that if you think about life, like all of us are living into some story. All of us get up each day with some idea of what we think our life should look like. We get up each day with some idea of where we want to go, who we want to be, what we think our future should be. And this is essentially, it's a story that we're kind of living into, or that we're thinking of in our mind, that we're hoping is going to come true for us. And so, in a very real sense, we're all living into some story, some narrative for ourselves. And I was recently challenged, and I was asked the question, asked to think about this in a little more detail and say, what is the story that I'm a part of, and what is the story that I'm living into? And I think it's a really important question. It's one I hope that each one of you guys here will take some time to think about. I think a movie like this one that we're here to watch tonight, one goal of it is to get people to start asking that question. So it's really interesting because Jesus invites us into his story, right? Jesus was a great storyteller. He was a fantastic teacher. He did some healings. There's a lot of things he did, but one of the cornerstones of his ministry was telling stories. And he told really good stories. And if you look at his stories, if you look at story after story that Jesus told, almost all of them are inviting his listeners into his story. Okay? Jesus is inviting his listeners, when he tells a story, into his story. And what do I mean by that? Let's go through a couple of examples. So first of all, Jesus tells, actually a fair number of times, he tells stories about weddings, right? You can think back through, look through the parables and things. There's like several different stories he tells about weddings. And what does Jesus say? Jesus says, I'm the bridegroom and you're part of the bride, right? So immediately he's drawing us into the story as the bride in this story. What else does Jesus do? Jesus tells stories about shepherding, right? He tells a story about a shepherd who loses a sheep and he goes in search of it, right? That's in Luke. And then we have in John, Jesus says, I am the good shepherd, right? So Jesus is telling a story, and he's writing us into it, of course, in the story of the sheep, right? He's inviting us to come into, there's another narrative that he has, right? There's this huge marriage narrative through Jesus' stories. There's this good shepherd narrative. Jesus has a kingdom narrative. He tells a lot of stories about kingdoms, multiple different parables that come at kingdoms from different ways. And Jesus says, he declares to Pontius Pilate, he says, I am a king, right? He's a king. He's inviting us into his kingdom narrative. And another one, it was interesting, Jesus said at one point, he said, take up your cross and follow me. Now when he said that, Jesus had never been anywhere near a cross, and so the people that heard it may not have really had a ton of context in terms of what Jesus meant, but we can look back on that now and see that Jesus was inviting us into his story of self, of dying to self, right? Because within a short time after Jesus said that, he was himself going to take the cross. And so all of a sudden that statement, when we read it in hindsight, has a lot more meaning to it. And so he's inviting us into his story of dying to self. So the reality is, my friends, that Jesus didn't come to inspire us to live better lives. He does inspire many people, but that's not the main reason he came. The main reason Jesus came was to invite, or one of the main reasons that Jesus came, was to invite us into his story and to invite us to follow him. I think it's really interesting if you look at, this always bugged me, especially when I was a little bit younger, that Jesus never explained how to become a Christian. Okay, you get into Paul's letters later and some epistles, and you get pretty detailed explanations, like some people call it the Romans Road, and there's several step process of here's how you can kind of enter the faith and become a believer. Jesus, he told stories and he asked people to follow him. That was what he did. And I think it's great, and it's clear the Holy Spirit inspired it, and it's wonderful that Paul came later and these other guys, and they kind of delineated a little bit more. But Jesus was trying to get to people's heart, and it's really, being a Christian is really a very simple proposition. It's deciding to enter his story and follow him. So, I want to share a little bit. Dan and I talked on the phone 2 or 3 times before I came, and we prayed about what to share tonight. And I'm going to take just a few minutes and share a little bit about my story and kind of how I got into filmmaking and how the Lord has worked in my life. And I hope this will be encouragement to you and that you'll think more about your own story and some of the things the Lord has showed me can encourage you. So when I was a wee tyke, I was born into a great family, very conservative family. I grew up, memorizing whole chapters of the Bible, which is a good thing. And when I was in high school, I was leading Vacation Bible School, and I was kind of certainly a model student, and a model church member. And then I wound up going off to college, and I studied mechanical engineering, which is very unrelated to filmmaking, actually, it turns out. So I studied mechanical engineering, and I continued to work really hard to do the right things and to keep my nose clean and to try and be the person that I felt the Lord was calling me to be. There's no problem with that, but the catch was that in my mind, I had never been to, it wasn't like my church preached this, because what I'm about to say is heresy. Well, my church didn't preach this, but I had kind of internalized this idea. It was pretty simple. I'll obey God's rules, and God will owe me a blessing. Okay? I thought that made sense. If I've read the Bible, if I do what God's telling me to do, then he's going to owe me a blessing, right? Turns out that's not the way Christianity works. We'll come back to that more in a minute. But anyway, that was the track I was on. So I had an opportunity came up. So in grad school, I was thinking of doing business. I wanted to start a business. And I wound up starting a film business and partnering with some folks who made this movie called Pendragon. And in the process of doing that, I left grad school. So the way grad school works at the university I was at is if you're a student and you have a professor, the professor sort of provides your funding for your education. And so when I decided to leave grad school to go direct Pendragon, I had to go talk to my professor. And it was actually a very emotional conversation. He said, "Chad, if you will stay and commit to finishing your education, I'll guarantee you funding for the rest of your time here in school." So that was a pretty big offer. And I wound up, I felt the Lord was leading me to go do the film, so I said, well, I'm going to leave. And I did. So went and did this movie called Pendragon. How many people have seen Pendragon? Anybody see that? Okay, some of you did. So we did that, and when it was finished, it was a bust. I was flat broke, I didn't have any money, I didn't have any prospects. I had actually just gone through an effort at, a relationship with a young lady that had gone nowhere, and I was really flat on my rear end. And I was very frustrated. I had become a very, very frustrated young man because I felt that I had done all these good things for God. And I don't know if you remember that little equation I had a minute ago. I do good things for God, he's going to bless me. It wasn't working out very well for me. And I was very bitter and very, very, very frustrated. So I wound up, I went back to my advisor and I said, could I come back to school here? And he was a very gracious man. He said, yes, but I had to start right at the bottom, so I was grading papers again, and all the stuff that you do when you first come into school. And when I moved back into school, Lord, and this was like a really, it seemed like a really dark season for me because all my hopes and dreams in this film thing had come crashing down. When I moved back into school, I could not afford to move back into the single unit housing I had. And so I moved in with 5 other guys because they had an attic room and they said $200 a month is what we're going to charge for rent. And I said, I can afford that. So I moved in with these fellas. And several of these guys, it just so happened, had a real relationship with Jesus Christ. Now, I'm sure you've seen this, but it's like sometimes you meet somebody who is maturing in their faith to where they are reorienting their entire lives around their relationship with Christ. And that's what I discovered when I moved into this home, was that 3 or 4 of these guys had really, they just had a deep, living, true relationship with the Lord. And I saw that, and man, I said, I want that. And it was interesting because I had heard all my life that, everybody has a God-sized hole in their heart. I've even told this to my non-Christian friends on campus. I'd say, everybody has a God-sized hole in their heart, and you need Jesus to fill that hole. And I remember one day sitting in my car, watching the snow come down, and thinking to myself, if I know that everybody has a God-sized hole in me, I know I have a God-sized hole in my heart, and I was thinking, if I already have a relationship with God, why does it feel like I have such a huge hole in the middle of my heart, right? And there was so much emptiness, so much frustration, so much bitterness in this season. So anyway, I wound up moving in with these guys, and they started unpacking some of the things that I was kind of misbelieving, honestly, about the Bible and about Christianity. And they started pointing me to the gospel, which is the good news. And if kind of the thing I was believing was, if I do the right thing, then God's going to bless me or whatever. The real good news is that Jesus pays when I break the law, and then God is going to bless me as if I had the same righteousness as His Son. Okay, that's kind of the gospel equation. So they started pointing me to that, and it was a season for me of seeing the Bible in a whole new light. And I had just a season of revival, honestly, in my heart, and beginning to see that God was more interested in a relationship with me than He was in what I was doing. Now, the interesting thing is this. So what I'm trying to say is that He cared more about my heart than He did even about my hands. Okay? Now, the interesting thing is, your hands will always, always, always follow your heart in the end. Your heart is the seat of your desire and what you want and where you're headed and what you're focusing on in your life. Your hands are always going to follow along after that. And Jesus wanted the very center of me. So it felt to me in this season, I felt like there's a story in the Bible about the 2 guys on the road to Emmaus. Jesus had just died, and he's come back to life, and nobody knows that yet. And the 2 guys are walking down the road, and Jesus shows up, and he starts telling them about himself. And it says in Luke, it says that he began opening the scriptures, the Old Testament scriptures, and explaining how he was in all the stories, right? How they all pointed to him. And it says that it didn't say their hearts burned within them as they saw that. And that was what this season was like for me, as I began reopening the scriptures and seeing the good news about Jesus was all over the Old and the New Testament. And it began to renovate my heart and my life. So, just a couple examples here. And this first one is from very early in the Bible. Okay, a couple of examples of passages that really meant a lot to me in this season. All right, of really discovering the gospel all through Scripture. So the first one here, it's in Genesis 17. Okay, now a lot of interesting things happen in Genesis 17, but one of them is there's this really bizarre ritual. Okay, Abraham and God have been talking, and Abraham says, God, how do I know you're going to bless me? And God says, well, it's kind of like an ancient Eastern handshake type thing, but it's a little different. God says, bring all these animals over here, cut them in half, and we're going to set the 2 halves of all these animals down and make like this row or gauntlet. And in the old days, in this culture, it was common to kind of settle a deal this way. So if you and I were going to make a bargain, and I was going to do something, you were going to do something, there was this reciprocity, then you'd cut up all these animals, lay them out, and we would both, instead of shaking hands, we'd walk together through this gauntlet as a way of symbolizing, may it be to us, or worse, if we don't keep the deal. Okay? So that's pretty, it's a little graphic, but I think we can understand kind of what the transaction was going on here. Okay, so Abraham does this, right? Then something really interesting happens. God does not tell Abraham to walk the path. Abraham doesn't. He sits. It says sleep comes over him, and he has a vision, and God is the one who walks the path. Okay, walks between the animals that have been cut in two. Okay, now I knew the story was here. I thought it was just like, I didn't know what it was. I mean, it was like a crazy story, right? This is like mind blowing when you start to wrap your mind around it, right? This is the good news. It's all packed up right here in Genesis 17, because what we have is God is saying that I'm going to bless you even at the cost of my life. And what happens on the cross is that God is the one who winds up, his body is broken for us so that he can keep his promise to bless us, even though we don't keep the covenant, right? So it's just fantastic. Here's another one for you, especially because I was a young person, I wasn't married, and I really wanted to be married, right? I thought, and that's a great thing to desire marriage. I'm married now, and I'm really thankful for it. But boy, it was so important to me. And I remember as I began to unpack the idea of God's love for us and the gospel, the picture of romance and how that fits into the gospel. So here's one that was interesting to me also. As a kid, I remember being really surprised at how often in the Old Testament we see God conflate or compare idolatry and adultery. And honestly, it a little bit bothered me. I remember being like 10 or 11, 12 years old and being worried in Sunday school that I'd be called on to read some of these passages. Because if you're an older person, you've read them, I'm not going to quote them. They can get a little bit graphic, honestly. And they're all through the Old Testament. We have them in Jeremiah, God is comparing adultery to idolatry. In Isaiah, he's comparing idolatry as being compared to adultery. It's in Ezekiel. It's the whole book of Hosea. So what is this obsession? Why is God over and over and over saying this? Is it just because, idolatry is bad? Obviously it is. But it goes a whole lot deeper, okay? And what God is trying to say here is that the relationship between a man and a woman, true romance, which is one of the most beautiful storylines that exists in our world, that God's saying that's a picture of my relationship with you, right? That's why he's pressing this analogy over and over and over again. And so as a young person who longed for that, it was so overwhelmingly amazing to me to see God saying that I want to be your first and this great lover and pursuer of your soul, and this great desire that I had as a young person to be known and to know someone else, and for intimacy and for all these things that are good things to desire in marriage. That God was saying, I created romance, I created marriage to be a picture of my relationship with you. And then you get into the New Testament, you see Jesus talking and all the stories he tells about marriage, and there's a great story about the king who has a marriage feast and they're compelling people to come to the wedding. Jesus' first miracle is at a wedding. And the very end of the New Testament, right in the very last chapter of Revelation, we get this line. It says, you should read it for yourself. It says, the Spirit and the bride say, come, right? And again, now we just got looped back into the story because the Spirit is calling people into the kingdom, and the bride, that's those of us who are followers of Christ, are calling people into the kingdom. So again, we're being entrained or pulled into this story, this great romance that God is weaving through history, all through the Bible, and we're in the story. So these things just started kind of exploding in my mind, and I began to really see the Bible as, yes, it's a book where God gives us rules that are going to lead us to, when we follow God's rules, it's always going to lead toward a better way of doing life, right? But I had been looking at the Bible as just a manual, as just a collection of rules. And it really is so much more, because it's really this great, great love story. It's a great romance. And it's God calling us to be a part of that story. And I began to see that I was the precious coin. I was the wayward bride. I was the woman caught in adultery. And Jesus was the one seeking me, desiring me, longing after me, dying for me. And it wasn't just that I was the center of the story. I began to discover that the whole Bible is actually about Jesus. And it sounds really simple, but as this was like coming clear to me, it really began to ignite my heart. And I began to see that the things that I'd been cramming into my heart, the idols, we were just talking about idolatry a second ago, things that I've been hoping would be fulfilling to me, things like my own performance, my grades, my righteousness, my reputation, my money, my job, my awards, my friends, that all these things were actually, they were counterfeit gods that I was looking to bring me satisfaction, that I had placed my hope in. Not that I already had a relationship with the Lord. I had done that when I was a kid, but functionally, on a daily basis, I was finding my hope somewhere totally different, totally other than in Jesus. And I began to realize that Jesus wanted my hope, my heart, and my affection. It kind of blew the lid off my faith. So that happened because Pendragon was a failure. And that to me is a huge encouragement, because it's a reminder that it's often in kind of the worst things that happen to us, God has something that he's going to teach or show us. And for me, I can tell you, down through the different passages of my life now, I've often have to look back at that, because right now there's some hard things or failures in my life, right, that are happening. And when I look back and see how he used that failure on Pendragon to bring so much good into my life, it's a big encouragement to me. So, also, continuing on with the story, these fellas that I wound up moving in with, because they were charging $200 a month rent, they were involved with a campus ministry called Crusade, or Crew, and I wound up meeting my wife through them, my now wife through them, so that's just fantastic. And then God wound up leading us to make a new film called Beyond the Mask. And the themes and the message of Beyond the Mask are related to where we find our identity and where we find our justification. What is it that we're placing our hope in? And is it in sort of hoping that if we follow all the rules, we'll find our way to acceptance? That's sort of what Will Reynolds starts off trying to do. And in the end, he discovers that no, it's only through Christ, and that love cannot ultimately be earned or bought. It's given, and God gives it to us. So we made a film called Beyond the Mask, and unfortunately, I really wish that with kind of the thing that happened with Pendragon, that story I told you, I wish that was the last bad thing in my story that happened, but it's not. So we started down the trail of making Beyond the Mask, and we saw the Lord miraculously provide several times. In particular, we had a funding deadline on June 15th, and we said if we don't have a certain amount of money, it was a six-figure sum, it was a big sum of money in the bank by this date, June 15th, we're going to take that as the Lord leading us to be done with this project. And we set this deadline like in December, and June, of course, is 7 or 8 months later. And literally at 8 p.m. on June 15th, I got a phone call from a guy who wanted to invest just the exact sum of money that brought us up to the amount that we'd set as the threshold. And to me, I know that you can read these old stories of the saints who have, it seems like every week God is miraculously sending them envelopes of money or something, but that never happened for me before. And I don't know how often it happens. If it happens regularly for you, I'd like to talk to you afterward. But for me, it was a first. And it was really cool to see God provide, because this was like not a small sum of money. I didn't have this money. There was no way we could make this happen. And God brought that together. So it's this clear stamp of his leading forward into making that film. And then a really puzzling thing happened, because once I kind of felt like, okay, if God has led so clearly, like now things should work out well, right? And so we made the film, and the film was very well received, had a very nice theatrical release. Many people really enjoyed the movie. We got a lot of nice, people said some nice things about it. Some people said some not as nice things, but in general, people really seemed to enjoy it. And then we signed a contract with a company to distribute the movie into a few small stores. I don't know if you've ever heard of like Walmart or Amazon or iTunes, or they went bankrupt, this company that we gave the title to. And so literally tens upon thousands of units of this movie were sold through all those channels. Every single unit actually was ever sold, up even to this day, was sold through Walmart, iTunes, Amazon, all the general market in America. all that money got swept up in this bankruptcy. None of it came back to us and the investors. So, and that's where it's, you got to come back. The Lord has really been teaching. This new lesson in this season has been one of dependence and faith, right? Saying, okay, I know you led, because I know he did. And now he's teaching us faith, teaching us dependence. And so I had a really interesting, I'll kind of close with this story because I know I'm running up on the edge of my time, Dan, but just talking about God's provision, we had, not too long ago, one of our investors on Beyond the Mask had said to us, he said, hey, I think the Lord is calling you to be in movies, and when this is all done, Beyond the Mask is finished, I want to help you do another film. So we were like, great. So then it came sort of, we were done working on Beyond the Mask, and we came back to this guy, and we said, hey, a year ago you said you wanted to help us do another movie. What are you thinking? And he said, well, I really wanted to do that, but I was planning to reinvest the money I put into the first project, and now that's, not coming back, And so we were very, we actually expected this answer, right? It was no surprise to us. We're like, okay, we totally understand. And he says, but I think you need to wait on the Lord for 3 months. And it was really interesting because just as the words were coming out of him, I just felt this anger and I guess pride coming up inside of me, and maybe a lack of faith, and saying, I can't wait on the Lord for 3 months. I have a family, I have a kid, I have to pay for health insurance, I have a mortgage. Like, I can't do that. We're at the end of our rope. We came to you because we're at the end of our rope. And I've heard at other times in my life, the Lord has brought the message, wait. And it's very hard for me to wait. And the Lord was very gracious, because this is the first time, again, this has ever happened to me. But no sooner did he finish saying, I think you should wait on the Lord 3 months, than he said, and while I can't make another film happen, I want to help provide for you guys for 3 months while we wait and see what God's going to do. So the Lord had provided again. And during that 3-month period, the Lord provided yet again with another group came forward and invested again in helping us do some further development. So we're just now finishing up development on a film that's hopefully going to follow Beyond the Mask. It's not a sequel, but it's a totally new film. And the Lord has provided that as well. And so I think what I take away from that is this. When the bankruptcy happened with our distributor, I was crushed. I thought, it's all over. We can never, if we can't pay back the investors on Beyond the Mask, we'll never be able to make another movie. But the reality is, God had brought together the investors for Beyond the Mask. And if God wants us to make a movie, or you to make a movie, or anybody to do anything, it's very easy for him to make that happen. And I'm not saying that we don't work hard, because we do, and I'm not saying that we sit around our rear ends or anything like that. But I am saying that the Lord has been teaching me something about trusting him, even when I can't understand the circumstances and everything else. So anyway, that's a little bit about my story, about how the Lord kind of has led into filmmaking and kind of bring us up to the present moment. So I'm really excited for Dan, what you guys are doing, and I'm looking forward to seeing the finished film here. I saw a rough cut of it earlier, and so anyway, I think that was it. Was there anything else I was supposed to cover? I think that's what we had. So, guys, thank you very much.